Hey everyone, one last video. This is it. Wrapping up the course, little bow on top. We're almost done. First and foremost, I want to say thank you for all of your hard work in this class. I loved reading your opinions about the readings, seeing your engagement with the material, learning from your observations and relating it to your own lives. It's really fantastic. Everyone relates to this material in different ways. We all have different life experiences. We all have different, backgrounds. And so it's just, for me, really fascinating and interesting to see how you relate to it. And so I really appreciate all the effort with the many assignments. I've asked you to do a lot of stuff. I hope you feel like it was worth it. I have a few wrap-up points for the course as a whole, and I hope the overview will actually help you a little bit with course reflections, get you thinking about some big picture connections. But before that, just a few points of emphasis on the final course reflection. The syllabus and the instruction page, I think, have everything you need. I've tried to be very clear about what I'm looking for, what you should do. So if it's not clear, please let me know. I'd love to get an email from you asking, like, what are we supposed to do here? And then we'll get it straightened out. In addition to that, I thought it'd be useful just to highlight a couple of things that are in the instructions already. So there's nothing new here, but just to sort of emphasize a few things. So there's really three components to this, and one of them is optional. So there's really two main things, and then maybe a third, depending on if you want to do it or not. Most importantly, describe what you learned in the class, right? That's kind of the general idea of a final. Tell me what you learned. How did your thinking change about history of diet and health and expertise? What did we learn from history that you weren't expecting? Where did you see connections between the history of diet and health in ways you weren't expecting? Like, do you learn to think differently about certain kinds of sources? Did you learn to read primary sources in a way you hadn't before, right? Think about the exercises, the discussion prompts, reading other people's stuff when you were asked to do that. Think about your AI experience. What did you learn? There's a lot of different things you did. It's probably all a blur at this point, but comment on what you got out of it. Let me be very clear. There's no set list of things I'm looking for. Okay. What you should absolutely not do is just go through the syllabus and be like, I learned this and this, and this, just like repackage it. I know it's on the syllabus. I know what you're supposed to learn. I want to know what you actually got out of it. That's a different question. As you describe what you've learned in the class, please make sure you're giving very specific examples from the readings. I want you to convince me that you've learned something. The best way of doing that is being specific. Okay. You may have gotten nothing out of the class and you want to talk about that. That's great, because in order to do that, you're going to give specific examples of here's the reading that didn't help me and here's why it didn't help me. You're going to be engaged with it. And that's what we're looking for. Number two, describe your learning experience. And this is distinct from what you learn, right? That's sort of the content stuff, the ways of thinking, ways of analyzing. That's one thing. But your learning experience is something else. Were the activities engaging? What was the material interesting in some parts and not in others? Obviously, there's no right answer to this question. Okay, it's your opinion about how the class went for you, right? And of course, you're the expert. I have no idea how it went for you, but I want to. So I'd love for you to tell me what your experience was, right? These 4-week summer classes are weird. They're super fast. They're really intense. They're relentless, right? So every day there's a new thing to do. We never meet. We never really see each other. It's super impersonal. It's not what college really should be like, but here we are getting the requirements done. So it's fine. What I want to know in this part of the essay, like, what topics did you like? What assignments did you find useful for helping you think about what's going on in the readings and the topic of the class? What topics connected together really well? Which ones seemed kind of like isolated and hard to relate to anything else? Which assignments or readings seemed like a waste of time? You just couldn't quite figure out why we were doing it. Didn't connect to anything. Was anything just busy work as opposed to something that tried to help you learn? I try to make assignments that are actually useful. I don't know if I'd say fun, but like they're useful. I don't know if I succeed. So I'd really love to hear your experience in the class. Bottom line, just tell me how the course went for you. One last caveat about this part of the assignment. Some people think, oh, this is a final. I'm getting graded on this. I shouldn't say anything bad about the course. That is incorrect. For one, being able to critique the class, this is what I was talking about before about what did you learn or not. Being able to critique the class, not just complain about it, but offer specific critique, shows me you were really paying attention. And so let me have it. Like, tell me, where did I go wrong? So I love constructive criticism. Please be nice. I know you will, but I do really want to know what you thought. What was your actual experience? What worked well? What didn't? Look, however bad the class is right now, it would have been way worse if it wasn't for all the suggestions I've gotten over the years. This is a relatively new summer class, so it's still kind of finding its footing. But in terms of topics and flow and sort of connections and so on, I've benefited tremendously from feedback. So pay it forward. I thank you in advance for your suggestions. The third part of the assignment is completely optional. So if this does not apply to you or you're not interested, no problem. It's an opportunity to tell me if the grade you see in Canvas does not reflect the effort you put into the class. Sometimes your numeric scores, the letter grades as they appear in Canvas, don't reflect what you actually did. There's a lot of reasons. Sometimes the prompts aren't very good. I tend to be a bit loquacious. It's hard to parse out what you should really be doing. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe I just wasn't clear. Maybe you were super busy. You were super tired. You were just trying to stay on track, which is laudable. So good job. But sometimes it's not going to be your best work. That's just the nature of this kind of class. So if you feel like that's happened a bunch of times, but you're really working, you feel like you've really gotten a lot out of the class because you put in a lot to the class, you should be rewarded for that in your letter grade. So make an argument to me that you did more than is being reflected. Again, you have to be specific, just as I was talking about before. If you just say, I worked really hard, I should get an A plus. Well, that's not super convincing. You need to tell me specifically what work you were doing that didn't manifest itself in your assignment. Okay, enough about logistics. Let's get to the finish line here. Just a couple of points. I hope I can connect a few larger themes that have run through the course, just really across the entire thing. And I want to start or kind of do this whole thing by going back to the student learning outcomes that I talked about in the first video, and they're very prominent in the syllabus because I think they're super important. Let's start with the third one. They're listed in order. There's three of them, and they're kind of in order of importance. So let's start with the third one. We'll have kind of like a countdown, and then when we get to the end, we're all done. So number three is to critically evaluate modern dietary advice in broad historical context. So look, you've done a ton of readings. You've read a lot of different articles from different kind of academic sources, from journalistic sources. Some have been fun, I hope. Some have been not fun, I'm pretty sure. They've come from a lot of different publications, journals, magazines, book chapters, and so on, and written by lots of different kinds of authors, writing styles, and so on. You've got primary sources, Galen, Cheney, and so on. So hopefully you've gotten this very broad cross-section of how people have been talking about diet and health over a long period of time. Okay, so what? And the answer, as I've alluded to before, is historical distance and perspective, kind of like the plane metaphor. If you get a totally different view than when you're on the ground. That's what I hope that you're getting out of the course. So seeing something like diet and health advice, for instance, outside of your own day-to-day life, outside of your own culture. I mean, it's a very Western-centric class, but outside of our own dietary culture, outside of our own values in the 21st century, looking back, decades and centuries, seeing this different landscape can really help us recognize some of our own implicit values and assumptions about diet and health. We sort of take it for granted that we're doing the right thing, that we're objective, that we're finding new knowledge, that we're the latest and greatest in terms of diet and health. And in many ways, absolutely, like for sure. But seeing the history of it gives us some ideas of other things that might still be going on, or ways in which we might not know quite as much as we think we know, because history has shown us we never quite know as much as we think we know. And in the process of doing all this reading that I just mentioned a second ago, I hope you were learning to ask really good questions about the sources, primary sources and secondary sources alike. Like, what is the point of this dietary advice? What point is being made? What does health mean? What does disease mean? How do you measure health? How does it apply to different bodies? What is the qualitative versus quantitative balance, if there is one? How is the author trying to gain trust and establish expertise? What are the assumptions behind the author's approach to research, health, dietary advice, expertise? What kind of evidence is being employed? What alternative views are not present or not being discussed in a particular text? So that's my plea for the value of the historical perspective. It allows us to see stuff around us every day that otherwise we wouldn't notice. We've been applying ways of thinking, ways of interrogating sources to diet and health, obviously, but it's true for everything. And I hope that you can understand how a broader historical perspective allows us to evaluate everything in a different light. And I hope you can apply the kind of thinking we've done in this class, not just the history of diet and health, but the kind of thinking that we were doing to any topic. Number two, I hope you're able to identify how expertise and the rhetoric of diet and health, the rhetoric of science, we started the course with this idea, have changed over time, how they're very dependent on cultural values and so on. When we talk about change over time, clearly some things have remained remarkably constant. Think about the role of personal anecdotes. Authors of dietary texts often explained they were sick, Graham especially, right? Changed their diet, they got healthy, and now they want to share this insight with you, right? Modern dietary people are really, really good at doing this. There's often a rejection of mainstream medicine, or at least major components of it, and the authors claim to have special insights that they want to give to you. There's also tales of success with patients, right? We saw this in Galen, but people are still doing it, right? I ate this diet, I was sick, And then I told my friends, and they all got healthier, and everybody's getting healthier when they take my advice. I've been helping people for a long time. It's working. You get these testimonials, right? Ways of building trust. There's also the appearance. We've seen this over and over throughout the course. The appearance of going beyond common sense. When you look at dietary advice, authors want to make their advice clear. They want to make it seem kind of obvious, right? Because they want you to follow it. Oh, of course I should be doing that. But it's also at the same time a little bit beyond what most people would come up with on their own, right? So it's not totally common sense. So it makes sense, but it's not so obvious anyone could come up with it, right? This is a really classic way of establishing trust, right? This is familiar to you, but a little different. And it's you just have this little bit to go before you get to real health, right? So buy my book, buy my pills, whatever. So there's a lot of constants in ways we've seen diet and expertise and the rhetoric of health play out historically. Some things have completely changed. Formal medical training, letters after people's names, regimented curricula, these have shifted dramatically. Biochemical research is completely different than what anyone was doing in pre-modern medicine. The ways we establish nutritional knowledge, the way we trust experts, who are the experts, really, really categorically different things, right? We've always had this concept of authority and expertise, obviously, but the way it happens is really different now. That's just categorically different. We've seen how nutritional research has become increasingly microscopic, right? We're studying gut biomes now and trying to understand this incredibly complicated landscape. I think we know more about the surface of the moon than we do what's going on in our own bodies because it's really hard to study. You can't just stuff people full of certain food and be like, what happens? And how do you measure this over time? It's really, really difficult. So we have categories of things that have totally stayed the same. We have categories of things that are completely different. And then there's also this mix, right? We see things that have kind of, in a big picture view, stayed the same, but the details have changed. For instance, Galen, every pre-modern physician talked about regimen, the way you live your life, how much you eat, sleep, kind of exercise. This is kind of this very holistic view of medicine. That resonates with us because we kind of see that too. Similar to that, we're starting to do a lot more research in terms of how things like artificial light might be affecting our general health, right? So outside of food, but these larger structural issues that have really profound effects on health in a chronic disease kind of way that we often attribute to food, which might not be as food related as some people think. So this idea of a holistic view of medicine has clearly persisted for a long time. That's not new, but the way we're thinking about artificial light, the way we're thinking about certain kinds of chemicals and forever chemicals and plastics that might be getting in our bodies, sort of these larger structural issues about chronic disease. It's a very categorically different way of thinking about cause of disease related to diet and health. Another quick example is the idea of a balanced diet. Right? Galen, all pre-modern physicians talked endlessly about a balanced diet, right? That's kind of the best they could do, which is good advice, right? I mean, you should have a balanced diet. What is balance to us versus Galen is really different. How do we achieve balance? How do we measure it? The fact that we do measure it, and Galen would have thought that's absurd, is significant, right? So here's another sort of strand of continuity, right? The idea of balance. But when you look under the surface, there's really fundamentally different ways of implementing that, right? Qualitative versus quantitative, common sense versus RDA recommendations. These are not commensurate in a lot of ways and leads to very different ways of thinking about diet and health. Number one, the most important thing I hope you get out of this class, the number one learning objective, to be able to describe how ideas of health, definitions of health, healthy diets, healthy bodies have been constructed both culturally and scientifically, right? It's both of them. And it's sometimes more one than the other. Sometimes it's an equal blend, but it's always both, always at the same time. Okay. Let's take Graham as a concrete example. People thought his scientific advice about diet was good, partly because it was grounded in research. Some of it was a little bit dubious, but he made a real effort, as you saw, to show the research, right? But when you read, it's obvious there's this religious moral component to what he's saying, but he's couching it in the emerging scientific language at the time. But that's not the main reason people believed what he said. That's not the main reason he had so many followers. He had a lot of supporters because his dietary advice reflected the society that his followers wanted to live in. It coincided with their virtues and their vision of a purer, more virtuous, and more natural society. Many people at the time, in the later 19th century, viewed industrialization and modern life as fundamentally corrupting forces and a decline from true virtue. And this was dangerous, not only for individual souls and salvation, but also the strength of the nation. Like we were not going to survive as a unit because everybody was sick, right? And everybody was eating too much processed food and buying baking powder and all these like terrible things and eating salt and so on. So his dietary advice reflected his cultural beliefs and the beliefs of so many people who shared them. Yet he grounded this advice, and you saw this, he grounded this advice in the science of the time. And we've seen this happen in every primary source. Whatever nutrition research, however it's being done, that gets used, but there's often this other agenda happening at the same time. So we get the language of quantification and other scientific forms of rhetoric. But you can see the reason Graham's dietary advice was so popular because it aligned culturally and morally with what other people wanted. In a nutshell, dietary aspirations are cultural aspirations. And I would say this is basically as true now as it's always been. When people give dietary advice, it's not just about how to be healthier. I mean, clearly that's part of it. It's altruistic. You're trying to help other people be healthier, have more active lives, and avoid chronic disease. Yeah, this is all good stuff. But baked into that kind of advice are very subjective determinations. This is unavoidable, right? It's not malicious. It's not, subversive. But there's these very subjective determinations about what health is, about how to be healthy. There's lots of choices to make. What health means for one person versus another person, how you balance statistical evidence with individual body reactions, what our priorities should be in terms of food and diet. One recent example from the course was the value placed on thinness, right? Valuing a thin body in the early 20th century led very directly to criticism of fat, of all kinds of fat, even though the science didn't really support that. And we learned about cholesterol and that kind of stuff in the low fat article. So there was science that made some suggestions, but the science wasn't actually that definitive and got proven wrong later. But culturally, the idea of thin equals healthy was so powerful. And it just kind of took over. And why was it so powerful? In part because it represented core American values of the early 20th century and arguably through the mid 20th century. Discipline, rationality, efficiency, frugality, strength, right? All prominent American values that you were supposed to display through your body. As I've repeated ad nauseum in other videos, and this is the last time, I totally promise, there's no purely objective knowledge simply waiting for our discovery. Okay, we decide what to measure, how to measure it, what the measurements mean. We interpret those measurements. We make judgments about them. We name things. We create frameworks of understanding. We do this in every science. You have to, right? You have to have a way of talking about it. And we know historically, if there's one thing we can learn from history, is that we're always wrong. We don't know how, and we don't know when we're going to have another sort of paradigm shift, if you believe in those sorts of things. But there's going to be another way. Like Newtonian physics was really great for a long time, still is. 99.99999% of stuff we do follows Newtonian physics really great. But when you get really small, like quantum stuff, quantum physics is a totally different thing, right? When you go really fast, like the speed of light, you need relativity. You need a different kind of physics. So we're already seeing, our frameworks for understanding, right? This is going to happen in diet and health too. That doesn't make scientific knowledge wrong or ineffective. I want to be really clear. I like science. Science is great. So to say that there's no purely objective knowledge doesn't mean that science is fiction or arbitrary or useless. It doesn't mean that we can't believe anything we read about nutrition. Like, for instance, we know lack of vitamin C causes scurvy. Like, that's a fact. Okay, there's no moral component there. That's a scientific fact. And sailors could now survive voyages because they knew they needed oranges. But there's a really big gap in understanding chemical interactions in the body, which we can't see and can't feel, and it's really hard to know what's going on, and translating that microscopic knowledge into macroscopic dietary advice. We can research the chemical compounds in blueberries. We can understand that they contain antioxidants that clean up free radicals that might otherwise encourage the corruption of cell production that leads to disease. Okay, we can learn that, and that's generally true. But how many blueberries should I eat for them to matter? How many should you eat? Is it really important compared to the zillion other things that we're putting in our body or how we live our lives? Isn't genetic luck far more important? Are there structural reasons that are completely overriding the amount of blueberries I eat, even though we can demonstrate that they lower causes of certain diseases? There's been a real surge in articles recently that describe how unhealthy social media is, not just from a mental health perspective, which you've probably all heard about, but from a physical one, right? Stress, anxiety, fear, anger, things that often happen with social media. These elicit physical responses that can compromise health in a chronic way. And it's very easy to think that that's actually coming primarily from food because that's something we're putting in our body every day. It's so obvious, right? And we know that food corresponds with things. It's less obvious social media could be creating chronic disease. There are so many variables. The gap between taking that research and converting it into macroscopic dietary advice about what you should eat and so on, that's where the moral and social values come into play. They always will. Again, this is not to say science is wrong, but clearly there's two layers here, right? The objective ways we inquire about nature and learn about what's going on, that's really valuable, obviously. But there's also this cultural layer, and the two are inseparable. As a human, we're just never going to be perfectly objective, right? So our science isn't going to be either. Right? That's great. That's what makes us human. That's wonderful. We'll see what AI does. I don't know. Can it be objective? It's based on what we feed it, so probably not. We'll see. Okay, so those are the three course objectives. I hope you feel like the course has lived up to those, and you can do those. If you haven't, it's my fault, and I apologize. One last sort of meta point around these three learning objectives. If you've learned anything about the history of diet and health in this course, that's great. Okay, fantastic. But as I made clear in the opening video, history is a means to an end. And the main hope is that you've become far more critical readers and consumers of information. So what does that mean? Well, okay, this really crazy example off the top of my head. Suppose someone gives you a spreadsheet. You have data. That's what data means, given. Like literally, that's the Latin root. Somebody gives you data and says, what can we do with this? What can we learn? Someone thinking microscopically, someone trained in all kinds of really cool data analytics techniques is going to look at the spreadsheet and say, well, we have this information, we can find correlations, we can do these associations. And what I want you to be able to do after a class like this and all the readings you've done, all the questions I've asked you to consider, I want you to be able to take that spreadsheet and think, why do we have these columns? How did we measure them? Are they measured in the same way? Are they the kind of same thing, right? They're all numbers, but are they the same kind of thing? How did we decide to keep track of these things? Who decided that? What might they be interested in that isn't important, or vice versa? What's being left out? What aren't in the columns, right? What's relevant but missing? What's the ultimate goal of this data in the first place, right? Even if the spreadsheet doesn't have it, like what do we need? How do we close the gap? I hope that asking those kinds of questions about our sources, you've been doing this all month, right? Who wrote this? What does healthy mean? What's disease? What kind of values does the author seem to have? That kind of thinking, I hope, helps you become more successful in whatever career or careers you end up in. Because every manager, every employer wants people who ask good questions. You can find people to do tasks and data analytics and whatever, right? That's easy. Critical thinkers, though, people who know the hard questions to ask, much harder to find. So I hope this class helps you ask better questions. So on the whole, I hope this course makes you more successful in life. That's maybe a little ambitious for a summer history course, but it's true. This is what higher education is about, right? Getting the perspective of the methods that allows you to think more broadly and deeply about the things you care about. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your time, attention, patience. Thank you for your persistence. It's only 4 weeks, but it's a grind. I mean, there's just stuff constantly. Thank you for keeping up with it. Thank you for your hard work. I've really enjoyed your responses again. I'm really looking forward to your final reflections, learning what you learned, what you thought was interesting. Course suggestions for improvement are always more than welcome. So thanks again. Stay in touch. Always ask why. Take care, everyone.